Hi everybody, welcome to this new podcast of GameCrimes. I am Ara, and today I wanted to introduce our new member, Victor.
Hello, I'm Victor. It's great to be here with you. And today we have a very special guest, the game writer, Emily Short. Hi Emily, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
So Emily is a game writer who's behind many titles that explore the edges of the interactive fiction genre. She has written over 30 works of interactive fiction. She has won some of the most prestigious interactive fiction awards, including the IFComp and the XYZZY Awards. I think I pronounced it correctly, so I'm glad. All right, she was the chief editor of the interactive fiction theory book. And
that
she
ultimately got handed off to somebody else, but I got it started, so that's...
Oh, right, okay, good.
I don't
corrected
want to claim that I'm due here, so...
All right. And she hosts several interactive fiction meetings for the community around the UK.
And that's one of the reasons why we have her here today. In a minute, we'll be asking Emily about her experience to see what can we learn from her extensive work in growing the interactive fiction community.
So, Emily, as we know from the Spanish scene, much is changing in indie game development these days. From your own experience, how much has the interactive fiction scene changed in these last few years? And is there any aspect that you find particularly interesting?
I would say it has really changed a huge amount in the past few years. When I started, and this goes back more than a few years, but when I started being involved with interactive fiction back around 2000 or so going back 15 years, it was a very small community. It was very hard to find. It had its own sort of specialized area of the internet. If you didn't know it was there, you weren't going to find it. And we didn't really have a way to popularize what we were doing either. And there really have been several major things that have happened, really kind of culminating in the last couple of years. One of them has been the growth of mobile platforms, which means that it's a lot easier for us to share games for people to play on devices that they're comfortable with at home. And that's also meant that there's more of a commercial market for sort of small text-based games. So that creates a little bit of space for what used to be a completely amateur community to have a little bit of a commercial outlet. Partly what's changed is that with the growth of the indie scene in general, there are a lot more websites that are devoted to covering unusual kinds of work, so we get a lot more exposure to the larger surrounding community. It's now normal for people to download games to play them rather than to buy them in a box at a store, so that allows us to get our things out there more freely. And finally, just the tools that are available to the IF community have become a great deal more sort of friendly and accessible. So when I started, you really kind of needed to be comfortable with a fair amount of programming in order to get involved. And there are now things like Twine, but also a number of the other interactive fiction tools that are designed to give more of a helping hand to people who see themselves primarily as writers, or people who are maybe would like to learn to code but are just starting out on that process. So they might not be comfortable using a command line interface. They might want something that they can download and use more comfortably than that. So the effect of all of those changes, and a lot of those things have to do with just the sort of the explosion of the web and the explosion of the indie gaming scene in general. But all of those things have meant that the interactive fiction community has become a lot more visible to the outside world. A lot of our work is more seen than it used to be. And there's kind of been a diaspora in that, like, we used to be this tiny little group where everybody was playing what little was released each year, and now there are, I would say, many different interactive fiction communities. There are interactive fiction communities in other languages. Italian, Spanish, and French and German are all somewhat active. There are groups of people who are using Twine for interactive fiction who did not come to that out of the sort of traditional community that I began in. So there's just a lot going on in a lot of different places now that it's almost challenging to keep track of all of it. But that's also an exciting thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the next question has a lot to do with what you just said. But anyway, I'm going to ask it. Where do you see the interactive fiction scene then going in the next few years? Do you think that, for example, people are going to be able to make a living out of it?
Well, some people are already making a living out of it, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Good
point.
Right. I do a lot of client work in interactive narrative. Some of it is for games that you would consider to be interactive fiction. Some are things that you would not. Some of what I do is sort of research and development work. But there are people who came out of the interactive fiction community who are doing that kind of thing essentially professionally now. And I don't just mean myself, but also John Ingold, the people at Fail Better, the Choice of Games people have a successful business. So there are people who are doing that in some sort of mixture of either making things that are commercial releases or doing consulting, writing work for other kinds of projects. So in that sense, that means that there are places for people to be going with this. And I think that is kind of important to the community to have a sense of there's something for us to grow towards. It's not just a matter of, well, you've won a few amateur prizes and that's kind of as good as it's ever going to get. So that kind of creates an opportunity to move into a bigger pond, I guess, to interact with the wider indie gaming scene. In terms of where interactive fiction is going as a whole, I'm really terrible at giving future predictions. Like, people over the years have asked me this question, and I've answered it in the past, and I've almost always been wrong. So I feel like I should bring that, and make something up. And I'll tell you what I think is going on that's really interesting right now. But there are often also sort of technological developments that come along that change things in ways that I hadn't been expecting. But that said, we're seeing some interesting. Aside from sort of the growth of the commercial side that we just talked about, we're seeing some interesting curiosity on the side of interactive fiction authors in terms of what they can do with procedural generation and text generation possibilities. There are people who are doing experiments kind of on the borderline between writing thoughts and writing traditional interactive fiction, where the text contains a much more variable element than it did in previous work. And that's exciting to me because the thing that I'm really interested personally in pursuing has to do with creating stories that build on strong social models. So we have a lot of work in the past that's built on modeling spaces, modeling objects. You have an inventory. You can carry these things around. You can solve puzzles by taking these items to new rooms and using them in various clever ways. And that's fine, but it also limits the kinds of stories that you can tell, because not every kind of drama that you might want to express as an interactive story is a drama that can be told with locks and keys or with setting things on fire or any of those sorts of things. So I'm really interested in this problem of, instead of worrying about programmatically modeling the physical space in detail, thinking about programmatically modeling the emotional space in detail. What do other characters want from us? How do they feel about us? How do our conversational choices, our gestural choices affect their response to us? And that's the space that I want to explore. But in order to explore that more deeply, we need both the social model, which is something that I've been doing research on for a while, and also the ability to express that social model back to the player so that they can really see what changes have happened. And so we need some dynamic text generation that's going to be able to make dialogue that is flexible. It expresses the mood of the character, as well as the factual information that they might want to convey to us at that point in the story. So that's one area that I think is really interesting. I'm doing a bunch of research there. I know a number of other people are exploring that as well. Bruno Diaz has just released a library that he has made for doing procedural text generation that plugs into Raconteur, which is a system for doing a particular kind of browser-based hypertext. So there are other people doing that kind of research as well. One of the other areas that I think is really interesting is the possibility of multiplayer interactive fiction and things in which other players are able to make choices that are affecting what you're allowed to do, things that you could either play in a room with somebody or online with a small number of other people, so that it's still a meaningful play experience. I'm not thinking of sort of massively multiplayer online things, but we've seen a couple of different platforms emerge in Seltani, Gunshow, and one or two other things where people are playing with this idea of what would happen if we made a space that people can come together and play these stories together collaboratively and improvise drama together, what might come out of that. So those are a couple of areas that I'm particularly keen to see developed further, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So the move towards more emotional interaction. So we have been talking a little bit when we introduced you about your work in growing and sometimes perhaps even creating the community of interactive fiction, which was very small and scattered when you began. So what would you say were the main obstacles you've been finding in growing this community?
Well, some of this comes back to kind of the accessibility of the tools and the work, and that's something that where things actually have become, I would say, much easier over the past couple of years, as I was sort of hinting at earlier. So when I first started out, most of the games that we were creating, not only did you have to have a certain amount of technical savvy to create the games, you also needed a certain amount of technical savvy to play them, because they required you to download a game file and then download a separate interpreter and install some things, and you really kind of had to be comfortable with your computer to do that. It was not the kind of thing that people necessarily would casually explore, even if you said, oh, hey, this is a really great game, it's so much fun, but then they see what they have to do to get it up and running, and maybe that just doesn't get past their barrier of how excited they are to try it. And then also just the game experiences themselves could be sort of challenging, because some of those a lot of that work required you to type commands in order to proceed and move forward in the story, and that also requires a certain level of player literacy to know what are the kinds of commands that you should put into this kind of game in order to make some progress. So there were a lot of just really straightforward practical barriers about getting people to be willing to try this material in the first place, letting them know that it existed, and then getting them over that hump. So a lot of the progress that we've made has simply been on the technical side of, there are more ways to play online where you don't need anything but to click through from your browser. There are more types of interactive fiction that either offer a tutorial and here's how to do the command line typing type of interaction, or they're not based around that kind of interaction at all. They're based on more of a hypertext experience where you're clicking things or you're making choices, and that tends to be a little bit easier for people to get into. And then just also kind of when we started out, there's this sort of interesting snowballing thing about credibility, right? Like if you are coming from a community where there are no commercial breakout hits and there are no names that anybody has heard, and the technology looks quite retro, it's hard to convince people that that's something that they should be taking seriously and covering on sort of outward-facing news and that kind of thing. And as we've seen a few sort of really successful pieces of interactive fiction, 80 Days has been great for this, but there have been a number of other things as well to a lesser degree. It's been easier to kind of convince news, sort of indie gaming news places to cover this kind of material and say, oh, look, this is a genre that exists now. It's not just a weird thing off in a corner somewhere. And that it snowballs. It gets easier to get people to put time into covering this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think I can even personally relate to that and to the feeling of, wow, I just did my first interactive fiction, and people being like, wow, great, how can I play it? And you start explaining the whole process of, you have to download this virtual machine, and then you install it, and then people go like, fine. One of these days you create a real game between inverted commas, and then I'll play it.
Right. So, The other thing that I get a lot now is it on Steam, right? Like there are many people for whom if the game is not on Steam, it doesn't exist. But now there is interactive fiction on Steam. Not all interactive fiction is on Steam, but there are a bunch of Choice of Games pieces. There are some other pieces by other people out there that you can find on Steam. And I think Andrew Plotkin has been working towards bringing Hadean Lands to Steam, which is a big, really challenging puzzle game type of piece. So again, it's kind of finding your way into those spaces that people are comfortable with as places to explore what you're doing, because trying to get them to come to you is really hard.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about these obstacles, and we would like to know, how are you overcoming them? What have been your answers to some of these problems?
Well, I mean, I first of all, I should say, like, I am not, I'm not the only person working on this, and on many pieces of it, I am by no means even the primary person working on it. Like, there are a lot of people pushing on different pieces of this problem. So there are a number of people working on getting the experience that you can have playing interactive fiction, different types of interactive fiction engines to generate a more polished and pleasurable and accessible experience, like we've just been talking about. So the people working on Twine, Chris Klimas, have made huge strides on that front. I know there are people who are working on sort of trying to make more attractive packaging for more traditional parser games, all of those kinds of things on the technical side. Then there are people who are doing things to inspire a sense of community involvement, because you can't. There's this cycle. You can't just grow the tools in isolation. You can't say, "Oh, we need better tools," and just go off and build the tools and come back, 2 years later. You need the constant feedback of people creating new, interesting tools, and then people using those tools and experimenting with them and coming back and saying, well, this is pretty cool, but on the other hand, here's what it doesn't do. Or using the tool to create something amazing that draws people in. Because the other thing is, you can have a really awesome tool that can do incredible things, but if you don't have a game that exemplifies that, if you don't have a show-off piece where people play it and they're like, I want to make something like this myself, then you're not going to get a user base for that tool. So there's this whole sort of cycle of trying to foster the tool development and then also foster the user base around those tools. So having game jams, having competitions, having forums where people can talk to each other and give advice about, here's how you use this tool. That's all really important, and you can't do any one piece of it by itself, or at least not very successfully. So I've seen some people come up with really interesting tool ideas, and in some cases put a huge amount of time and effort into them and build really interesting things, and just not ever have the user base materialize for that because they lack that, that kind of selling point game for that tool, or because there's no forum for people who are using the tool to hear about each other and form some connections and help each other. And that's just vital. You have to have all of that.
Yeah, like a one kind of flagship game. As in, to put an obvious example, what Fallen London has done for Story Nexus.
Yes. And, for Twine also, I mean, the interesting thing about Twine is it's enormously popular now. Everybody in this space has heard of it. Many people outside the space have heard of it. Twine existed as a tool for a number of years before it had anything like that kind of popularity. And what really made the difference was it being adopted and shared and taught and talked about by Anna Anthropy and Porpentine and several other people in that group. And suddenly, because there were these examples of here's how to make something really powerful and moving with this tool, lots of other people came to be involved with it, but it had a fallow period of, I don't know, probably at least 5 years that the tool existed, but it hadn't taken off like that. I may be getting my timeline wrong because I didn't look that up before this.
No worries.
I mean, but that's my sense of it. I know it was around for a while.
Mm-hmm. What lessons can we potentially derive from your experience, perhaps for somehow related scenes like the Spanish indie scene, perhaps in the way you've been seeing these things evolve? What do you think could have been done perhaps differently, or what has been done that was like really spot on? And not just perhaps you, or as only you, but in because
right.
You don't have that much responsibility. you're not to blame. What sort of lessons do you think we can extract from that? Not just from your personal direct involvement in it, but from the industry or the scene as a whole?
Well, I think the sort of number one thing that I would say here is that there isn't no one-size-fits-all solution for building your community. And what I mean by that is, I was just talking about how we need forums, we need competitions, and that kind of thing. And I think that's true, especially in the interactive fiction community. the sort of social construct of having a competition that people submit to and they can see each other's work and comment on each other's work has been a major driver in moving the community forward, getting people to know about what other community members are doing, and creating a sense of excitement at a particular time of year, because there's one big competition that happens every October and November. I know you know this since you entered last year, but for the sake of the listeners. So that's an important thing, but that kind of thing is not what everybody wants to do. Not everybody wants to be in competition. Not everybody wants to have their game ranked and responded to that way. Sometimes people would rather do something that is more of a game jam kind of thing, where it's not so much about like, oh, we're going to polish this for months and months and then we're all going to critique it. It's about, oh, you're going to finish something in this set amount of time and get yourself past any blocks that you might have. Some people don't respond well to either of those things. So just last year, and I think again this year, I'm hoping again this year, Aaron Reed has taken the old Spring Thing competition, which used to be just a straightforward ranked competition, and changed its format to something more that he's calling a festival instead. And instead of being that kind of ranked, straightforwardly ranked thing, it has a space that invites people called the back garden. If you don't want to be in the main part of the festival, you can enter your piece into what they call the back garden, and that's kind of declaring that this is an experimental piece. I'm putting it out here because I think it's interesting and unusual, or maybe it's something that I'm also planning to release in another context that's also allowed in the back garden, which wouldn't be allowed in the main part of the festival. And those kinds of things mean that you can share bits that are not polished in the same way or not designed around the same sets of concerns, maybe. So you have all of these kind of different methods of letting people create and letting people respond to each other's work. And I think having a lot of different angles on that and allowing there to be, I think the competition side is good because there are people who really like the feeling of, oh, I'm going to try and do my best and there's something for me to achieve here and I really want to try to win. Some people respond very well to the possibility of trying to win, and other people don't, and that's fine. And I think if you're going to have the sort of richest community you could have, you want to make that comfortable for everybody. The other sort of that's about sort of cultivating the creative space, but then there's a whole sort of range of other institutions that exist around that also, like blogs and zines and spaces online where people can promote things to one another. One of the big successes of the interactive fiction community is a website called IFDB, which is a database for basically anything that somebody considers interactive fiction can have an entry in IFDB. And it allows people to review, it allows people to tag, it allows people to make lists of games that they think are interesting for one particular reason or another. And it doesn't have to be, this is a list of my favorite games. Sometimes people have made, here's a list of games that I think are appropriate for playing with your children. Here are games that are, particularly good Lovecraftian horror. Here are games that are, so trying to help people curate the work that's being produced by the community and helping surface that, because you don't always, as an author, you're not always able to do all of the work of promoting your game that you might want to. So allowing other people to kind of help with that is really important as well. I had one other sort of main point I wanted to make, but I don't know if we're about to run out of time to do that.
No, just go on.
Yeah, okay. you can go on. We are. It's minute 23, so anyway, yeah, we are okay.
Okay. So the other sort of major point that I would make is that, and this goes far beyond the IF community or indie communities or any, this is true just in general. The strength of the retention in communities has a lot to do with whether the people in that community have strong one-on-one relationships with a few other people in that community. Like, do you have people in that community that you would consider actual friends? That you would want to spend time with separate from that community? And that makes a huge difference. And there's been sort of research on, like, community cohesion depends a lot on that. And that doesn't, obviously, this is a kind of thing where no individual leader can make that happen, because the whole point of it is it's about sort of cross connections within the group. And you personally cannot be best friends with everybody in the group unless it's a very small group. So, then the question becomes, how do you kind of foster that kind of thing to happen? And that's where I think doing in-person meetups can be very helpful, because getting people to see each other and spend time together socially creates a little bit of that connection that might not otherwise be there through the internet. The IF community has also benefited from a couple of different kind of chat rooms and chat contexts over the years. So there's a MUD that's been around for about 15 years called IF MUD that people hang out on. And most of them are people who came there because of an interest in interactive fiction, but it's really become basically its own independent social community. But that helps produce that kind of long-term cohesion that's been really important. And then there's another quite recently started up chat room on a website called Euphoria, where people, again, are kind of hanging out. They're often talking about interactive fiction. They're sometimes exchanging hints about technical problems, or saying, oh, this game just came out, I played it, what did you think? Those kinds of conversations happen there. But there are also a lot of just personal conversations about what's happening in people's lives. And those kinds of things, I think, help keep the system together and keep it working. So it feels a lot better, if you're putting a huge amount of time into something, especially something that is really an amateur project, and IF is an amateur project for most people involved with it. It feels a lot better to be doing that if you have a few specific people that you are interested in their feedback, or they're going to like it, or you're going to have some kind of positive personal interaction because of what you're doing. So I think that can be pretty huge.
Right. So after this break, let's call it like this.
No advertising though?
Okay, we're going to proceed with the rest of questions. And I think it's my turn. So, we've been talking about ways to grow interactive fiction communities and give it more exposure. And this growth probably means not just bringing more people in, but also a better inclusion of people from more diverse backgrounds. What do you think can be done to foster diversity?
So I think there are a couple of different pieces to this. One has to do with making sure that the spaces that you have available include at least some spaces that are that have clear codes of conduct, that have expectations that people are going to be considerate towards one another. That doesn't need to necessarily be terribly elaborate, but having a few moderators who are willing to exclude really inappropriate, sort of attacking discourse can be quite important, because just a relatively small amount of harsh or trolling interaction can be enough to drive large numbers of people out of your community, and you can lose people that you don't even know you're losing that way. So that's part of it, is just be willing to have some, at least, even if you want some spaces that are open to whatever kind of discourse, that's fine, but having some that are protected and moderated in that way is really important. And I think the more you're intending a given space to be for growing those interpersonal bonds that I was talking about earlier, the more important it is to have sort of an expectation of civility and to treat the space that you're in more as though it were somebody's living room, and you're going to say, okay, you're not going to interact with other guests in this space in a way that would be inappropriate in a social context. We all have an understanding of what you're allowed to say to people face to face. Let's try and extend a similar type of understanding to this space, even if it's online. So there's that kind of just making sure that people are not attacking one another and are not being inconsiderate towards one another at that level is quite important. The other thing is needing to consider the parameters on your institutional, on your institutions, right? Like if you have game jams that are 48-hour game jams and you expect people to come to them and stay up all night and eat a bunch of junk food, that's awesome, and you'll attract some people, and then other people are not going to be able to cope with that at all.
Sounds great.
People like me, I'm too old to stay up for that long at once, so I cannot deal with it anymore. It will make me feel sick for the rest of the week, so I just can't do that. if you have people who have children, they're going to have a hard time doing that. So part of it is also about thinking about like what are the implications of whatever system that we've set up. Who are we excluding by doing that? And are there things that we could possibly consider to reach out to those people, or alternatives that we could make that would be good? So this was not my idea, and it's not particularly tied into the IF community at all, but something that the Oxford Indies group and some of the associated indie game developer groups did was have a gamers luncheon last year that was a picnic, and it was held outdoors, and it was fine to bring small children, and people came with their families and did board game creation jams and other things like that. And there were talks about various aspects of indie game development, but it had this very sort of open space, open time. It's okay for you to be distracted, to need to come and go. It's okay for you to have kids. And that created a very different kind of experience than you would get at a sort of standard conference setting. So those kinds of things. And if you don't know what issues might be excluding people, then making the effort to ask, to do some polling, to invite people to give you their feedback. Sometimes people are hesitant to bring up issues that they might have, or they'll just think, okay, that's not for me, I'm just not going to go to it, but they don't necessarily bring that up. So if you signal to them that you do actually care, and like maybe you aren't aware of what their concerns are, but you would like to include them, that's an important signaling too, in order to start to collect that kind of information, and then you can think about like, what are we going to do about this? And again, that doesn't mean you can't do your 48-hour game jam with the junk food if that's what you want to do. It just means you might want to have some other options as well. And then the other thing that I would say is you really want to actively invite the kinds of people that you want to hear from. There have been, again, at this point, I'm not repeating information that's unique to the IF community, because there have been plenty of studies about this, that if you put out an open call for people to present or to talk about their work at a conference or in some kind of, sometimes even in an unconference kind of setting, often you will tend to get people who feel already the most confident and the most like they belong to that community, which very often in a games context will be the white men. And if you want to have a more diverse range of people represented, and you want to start building up that sense of this is a space where we welcome input from other types of people, then often it's useful to explicitly invite people to present, because they may not think of putting themselves forward if they are not the sort of person they've already been seeing on stage. And so once you kind of get that rolling, then you can sort of start improving the situation overall. But you do need to kind of, if you're organizing those kinds of things, think about, like, who do I know that I could bring in that would not be the same sort of person that we've had every time before?
Also, aside from what we can do as individuals, what you just said about, creating game jams with junk food, but also creating other other kind of meetings for other kind of people and etc. What needs to be changed on a larger scale, you think? Meaning society, government, etc. I know, this is a very general question. That's why I was thinking, okay, let's keep it for the second part.
It is a huge question, and I don't think... Yeah. I mean, the answers aren't easy, and I also have, somewhat political views on this. So part of it has to do with... if we want to be hearing from more people, and we want to be hearing about more kinds of experiences, right now, both from a sort of government structure point of view and from an economic structure point of view, we have a setup that tends to be a little bit winner take all, right? Like, if you are the kind of person who wants to work on the kind of project that makes a AAA game, then there is a space in the industry that is at least notionally for you. Like, whether you can get into it or not is another question. But the space exists, and hypothetically you could be earning a salary doing that, and the kind of game that you want to make is well represented. But there are all sorts of challenges if what you want to create is not that kind of thing, or if you are somebody who doesn't feel comfortable in the kinds of companies that build those games. And there are a huge number of reasons why that might be. And so I think we need models of funding and support that help people create those kinds of unusual pieces that aren't necessarily about, like, are you going to be able to sell on a grand scale? Are you going to be able to move $60 console games? And instead it's about, are there enough people in general who are interested in what you're doing to kind of to provide an undercurrent of support that can keep you going. And we're starting to see some of that with crowdfunding, where people who have Patreons that are supporting the indie development that they want to do, people who have had successful Kickstarters. I think there are still some serious challenges about both of those models specifically. And one is Kickstarter obviously is designed for if you have one ambitious project that you want to get off the ground, it tends to reward people who already have somehow or other built up a base of fans because they're going to provide you with a sort of starting point. And it also tends to reward a lot of nostalgia work. As we've seen, a lot of the sort of big Kickstarters have been people funding what is basically a continuation of some existing genre that they're already very excited about. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is not sort of the innovation hotbed that it might be and that I would ideally, in my dream life would be seeing. Yeah. And conversely, with Patreon doesn't necessarily have some of those problems because you can fund somebody on a month-to-month basis. It doesn't have to be tied to a specific project. But there, the funding model is set up so that they need to be putting out something every month. And that, again, is not necessarily the best form of support for a medium-term project. So I feel like there's kind of a hole between Patreon and Kickstarter in terms of what kind of funding model could exist that would allow better support for the creation of unusual or experimental or groundbreaking work that doesn't yet have a huge audience, or perhaps will never have a huge audience because it's speaking to a particular kind of experience. So that's one issue. Another issue is discovery. And this is a problem everywhere, and it is seriously unsolved, and it just seems to get worse and worse, actually. Which is that there is so much on the app stores, there is so much on Steam, there's so much out there floating in the broad sea that is the internet, that it's really hard for people to find work that might be out there that they would really enjoy, and conversely hard for the creators of those unusual things to find their audiences. And I don't really know what the solution to that is. People have tried a variety of things in terms of, having Steam curators and having whatever algorithms they are that manage, the Amazon store and Google Play and those sorts of things. The main thing that we know about all of that is that it doesn't really work yet. In terms of, I would like to have an experience where I could go on to the game site of my dreams, and because it knows what I've played before, it's able to bring to the surface for me things that I'm going to really enjoy next, but that might include some things that are a little bit off the beaten path, introduce me to some new authors I haven't already heard of. That would be wonderful. But I don't know how that happens. But I think that also is pretty important in terms of getting people to the point where they can develop the kind of following that they need so we can have a really sort of multi-voice kind of community. And then sort of getting beyond that into the actual sort of political side of things.
Okay.
Well, you did ask about government, right?
We did.
This is not a Spain-based answer. This is a U.S.-based answer because that's where my background comes from. But maybe it applies elsewhere too. I think that we have a really messed up relationship with work and money and value and human value in general. And there, at least in the U.S. and in U.S. political discourse, there's a really strong bias towards the idea that everybody ought to be working lots of hours if possible, that is the same thing as creating value for society, is working for somebody else. And it's not very, the conversation about that doesn't really reflect the fact that, first of all, not everybody is able to find a job. So some people are involuntarily unemployed, and it's not even a question of are they willing to pursue better skill sets. It's just some parts of the U.S. are hard to find jobs. Some situations are just really pretty intractable. And then there's also the fact that companies have become a lot more willing to sort of treat workers as completely fungible and replaceable and say, I'm going to hire a contractor for 3 months, but I have no loyalty to you as an employee, and I can let you go at any time I want to. You have no guarantee that this is going to last. And when things are that unstable, and I'm seeing them being that unstable for a lot of very well-educated, smart, hardworking people, it's not a reflection on who they are as people at all. When you see that creates all kinds of sort of extra problems around them, because it's harder to make investments, it's harder to buy property, it's harder to do anything that is any kind of financial commitment when your employment life is that tricky. And I think the economy has gotten into a very uncomfortable place for a lot of people. And for that reason, I would really like to see a much stronger sort of social safety net, and maybe that's never going to happen in the U.S. I don't know, but I think it would be terrific if we were willing to admit to ourselves, look, not everything that everybody does needs to be paid for by an external source. First of all, like there is value that people are putting into society that is not measured accurately in that way. And I don't just mean, I obviously we got into this conversation via creative work, so I do mean creative work, but I also mean things like, parents who stay at home, both mothers and fathers, they're doing important work. It's not particularly,
exactly.
It's frequently not valued very much, certainly not financially. People who are caring for elderly members of their family, again, that's really important, and it's not necessarily reflected very well or supported very well financially. But just in general, we have an economy where it's not clear to me that we actually need everybody working 40 hours, let alone that like 50 or 60 that a lot of people actually work. And we maybe just having some different expectations and some different institutions around employment, and then also around the support of people who are not employed, would make for an environment where it's safer to take risks and people have more spare time to develop what they're interested in developing. And I think both of those things would be really, really healthy for the creative arts.
Well, I can say for myself that I would love to see that happening in Spain.
Yeah, I guess anywhere. And we are talking about the first world, so we're still kind of okay. Well. But it would be great. So, do you have any other questions, Victor?
No, I was just wondering, we are quite nearing the end of it, I think. Is there any other thing that you want to say? Any other piece of advice that comes to mind, Emily?
Gosh. Apparently not.
All right.
Okay. That would be it. So, but I think I have to still ask, apart from all your work that we have covered on supporting and growing the community, are you working right now on any super cool, super secret project that we can keep in between you, us, and GameCrimes audience of millions, obviously?
Yes.
Promise it's not going to work.
Especially those million of people who are listening to us.
Yeah, no, definitely. If not billions.
Well, I sort of hinted at this when we were talking about what we're interested in, where I think things might be going, which is that I've been putting a lot of time into working on the kind of procedural dialogue side of my research. And in the long run, and this is definitely not a thing that I'm going to be releasing, well, certainly not this year, but it will be, it's a while out there. But I really want to get to a point where I can release a tool that is directed towards interactive drama style things that are about this kind of interpersonal scenes, dialogue heavy interactive fiction of a kind that has more of a model than Twine Games, is a completely different kind of model from Inform or Taz or Hugo Games, and just something that ideally would be user friendly enough that people can kind of write their own little interactive play scripts and see that play out. So that is a thing that I would like to accomplish. I don't know how long it'll be before it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Emily, and thank you everyone for being here with us, listening to our new podcast.
Yeah, see ya!
Bye!
Yeah,
Bye-bye!